United States, Prime Minister David Cameron of UK, and Deputy Prime Minister Tang Jia-xuan, Deputy Prime Minister Dai Bingguo, and Foreign Minister Li Zhaoxing, and Chairman Jack Ma of Alibaba, and many more influential speakers have participated in ALC. Due to concerns around the COVID-19, we have decided to postpone the 11th ALC until November. And this month, we organized ALC Webinar with our knowledge partner in China, Cheung Graduate School of Business. Our webinar will be aired on live throughout the world, simultaneously translated in Korean, English, and Chinese. And live talks will be aired through chosun.com, ALC YouTube channel, and Chinese platforms. Before we move on, I would like to first explain the format of today's event. It is going to be a 90-minute session with 3 5-minute long keynote speeches and 1-hour panel discussion. Today's topic is global economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. We are now living through the most uncertain moment of our lives. Coronavirus lockdowns pushed the world into sharp and painful recession. And the depth and speed of the decline will rival that of a Great Depression. Here, the question is, will the aftermath be as painful, or will this pandemic give us rise to a new era of human development? And how long will it take for the economy to recover its pre-pandemic strength? And before we move on, let me introduce our speakers, followed by, in the order of the event, Zhou Li, Assistant Dean of Cheung Graduate School of Business, and Xiang Bing, Founding Dean and Professor of China Business and Globalization at Cheung Graduate School of Business, and Robert Barro, Paul M. Warburg Professor at Economics at Harvard University, and Dr. John Kwang-Woo, Chairman of Institute for Global Economics and former Chairman of Financial Services Commission. And now let's begin. Dr. Zhou Li, the Assistant Dean of Cheung Graduate School of Business, will give us the opening remarks. Dean Zhou Li, welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Kim. Hello, everyone. 您好，你好。On behalf of CKGSB, that is Cheung Graduate School of Business, I would like to thank you all for attending today's first Asian Leadership Conference webinar, which are greatly honored to be co-organizing with Chosun Ilbo. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Chosun Ilbo for having invited the CKGSB professors to speak at the Asian Leadership Conference in Seoul for the past 8 years, and giving us the privilege to co-host this first Asian Leadership Conference online event. CKGSB is a privately-owned private business school, was established in Beijing in November 2002. More than half of our faculty members were tenured professors at the top business schools such as Wharton and the Yale School of Management before they joined CKGSB full-time. 3 of our professors became the chief strategy officers of very distinguished companies like Alibaba and Financial Services and JD.com. The school has become the first choice for management education among many Chinese most influential business leaders, including the founders of companies like Alibaba and Tencent, and the 35 unicorn companies. More than 50% of our 14,000 alumni are at the chairman and CEO level. Collectively, they lead 25% of China's most valuable brands. In addition to the courses in Chinese, we offer executive education programs in English and other languages. So far, more than 3,000 foreign executives from Fortune 500 companies in Asia, North America, and Europe, as well as many leading companies and startups from all major economies, have studied at CKGSB. We are going to have our first online course in July in English. More than 30% of our English MBA students are from other countries. We are very pleased to see more and more of them are from Korea. Since mid-February this year, as part of our contribution to the fight against the COVID-19, CKGSB has organized more than 50 webinars to share the insights from our world-class faculty and our business leaders alumni. We started offering bilingual webinars in April, and today is our very first time organizing a global trilingual webinar in English, Korean, and Chinese. And I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to many of my colleagues at CKGSB and at Chosun Ilbo for their tireless efforts and great cross-cultural teamwork to make this possible on a very tight schedule. The virus has kept our bodies from traveling, but nothing can stop our minds from sharing our learning. We are privileged today to have 3 distinguished speakers from the US, China, and Korea. They will provide important insights at a time when the world is looking for answers to the massive challenges and unprecedented opportunities created by the COVID-19 pandemic. I wish you all a pleasant day of learning today and hope to see you in Seoul for the ALC in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Zhou. We also hope to see you again this November. And next, we will begin our keynote speech session. Mr. Xiang Bing, the founding dean and professor of China Business and Globalization at the Cheung Graduate School of Business, will give us the first keynote speech. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Ms. Kim, and thank you for the kind introduction. It is really a privilege and a delight to be here today to share with you my personal views and assessment on the potential consequences of this pandemic. And my views, my analysis of the potential consequences are at several levels. The first is really global level. That's including global governance and international organizations. The second one, the national level. If this whole ongoing, unfolding event have a huge consequence of global order, what are the potential competitiveness of each country or nation or regions? Thirdly, is at a company level. And because the time constraint, maybe I should start with the global one. Many of the issues, challenge we have today predate the outbreak. Prior to the outbreak, we already had really dysfunctional global governance. One of the reasons for that was the US, the indispensable nation for the global governance system to work, has been so reluctant to take on that leadership role. And the potential, this trade conflict between China and US, a rivalry between China and US, is not doing a positive contribution. So when US is absent from this global leadership role, when the number 1, number 2 economy, US, China, contributed more than 50% of the GDP, global GDP last year, about over 90% of global economic growth last year. When those 2 economies, when don't see eye to eye with each other, I see the great difficulty for a functional global governance. Secondly, for the international organizations, when when Trump administration taking America First approach and have been withdrawing from many of the international organizations, I think that may be the beginning of end of WTO era, with this coronavirus outbreak that may officially spell the end of this WTO era. I may think we already enter a new era without a WTO. I see these flood of bilateral, trilateral, regional deals emerging, having emerged, will be emerging in the future. So I think at the national level, business level, we're going to see very different landscape as far as trade investment concern. And at the corporate level, I think these restrictions, not only on trade, but also people movement, at least for the coming 1 year or so, and then maybe capital, will be a challenge for companies. Global companies really need to rethink about the global supply chain issues. They want to not only take advantage of the cost, economy of scale, specialization, but also they want to diversify a little bit. And they have to be prepared for the potential hiccups like this ongoing pandemic in the future. So there are going to be a lot of changes for coming years. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Xiang, for your informative, insightful speech. And next, Mr. Robert Barro, Paul M. Warburg, Professor of Economics at Harvard University, will give us the second keynote speech. Welcome, Professor Barro.
Thank you. I'm glad to be participating. So from the perspective of the US and other rich countries particularly, we're experiencing an unprecedented, sharp, voluntary reduction in GDP, which was engineered in order to try to curtail the pandemic. This is really an unprecedented situation, but the most important issue is not the current size of the contraction, but rather what will come next in terms of the speed and size of the recovery once places have reopened. I'm actually pretty optimistic on this front. I expect a sharp V-shaped economic recovery in the United States and elsewhere, partly because capital is basically in place. It's not a situation where we had destruction of physical or human capital. I think most of the linkages between firms and their workers and between firms and suppliers will be maintained. And I don't think too many firms will end up going out of business, particularly larger ones. There's a very limited empirical history to look at to assess exactly what a V-shaped recovery will be and how probable it is. I've tried to look at the history, and if we have a chance later, I can try to talk about that. But that's my best guess about what will follow on the current downturn. There's really no point in the current situation in having massive general policy stimulus, monetary fiscal policy. Normally you do that in order to try to boost GDP. But in fact, we've already determined that we wanted to have this contraction in economic activity in order to fight the spread of the disease. So given that, it really makes no sense in the short run to be offsetting that with general monetary and fiscal stimulus. It's a good idea for central banks such as the Federal Reserve to be keeping financial institutions intact. You don't want a financial crisis to add to the current situation. And I think for the most part, that's been happening. That's been done satisfactorily. Similarly, you don't want a big problem in housing market. So those are not the current sorts of problems. I think there's some case to be made for governments to subsidize firms maintaining their workforce, keeping the linkages between firms and workers, and also keeping firms from going out of existence. So subsidy programs along those lines, of which some of that is in the recent US package, that makes sense. I think it also makes sense to expand social safety net programs. But of course, the United States and many other places have gone way too far. And it's quite incredible how much money is being spent on these programs in the United States. Some of it, like the excessive increase in unemployment insurance, is going to make it more difficult to have a strong recovery because basically workers are being subsidized not to go back to work. So I'm hoping that that program won't stay in place beyond July, which is the current setting. Basically, I think we should see how the massive fiscal intervention that we've already done in the US works out, not pile on more of that. There's some evidence, I've been studying the great influenza pandemic, 1918 to 1920, that public health interventions, so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions of the sort that have been put in place, they clearly work to flatten the curve in the sense of lowering the peak death rates. That's happening now, and it happened also in 1918, 1919. It's much harder to know what the longer term effects of these interventions is in terms of cumulative death from either the flu in 1918 or the coronavirus currently. It's clear from the prior experience that you need more than, say, 4 weeks in place for these interventions to be effective in the longer term. Possibly 10 to 12 weeks is sufficient. Don't really have the evidence on that from the 1918 experience. I know I don't have much time. Let me try to illustrate a bit about what the trade-off might be in terms of thinking about saving lives versus saving economies. So I want to give you some illustrative components of this kind of a calculation. The first thing you need to know is what's called the value of a statistical life. There's a large literature on this, which we can discuss a bit later if there's time. A common number used there for the US and for other rich countries is about $10 million per life saved. And I'm going to take that as a reasonable number. It's actually a pretty large number. Second question is, how many lives do you save by having the kinds of interventions that have been put in place over the last few months? So in the US, for illustrative purposes, we are approaching 100,000 deaths. And I'm going to think about it as though maybe you can save an additional 100,000. That would be a kind of reasonable magnitude. If you multiply that by $10 million per life, you get an aggregate calculation. What is this all worth? That's $1 trillion. And that's 5% of the US annual GDP. Now, it's a lot different if you think you can save 1 million lives, which is the kind of number that's more like the great influenza pandemic, 1918. Then it would be worth 10 trillion, and that would be a half a year's GDP. So that would be a much bigger deal. The third thing is, how much are you losing in economic activity because of these interventions and shutdowns? I'm going to take that as though GDP is reduced by 20% at an annual rate. Then it's worth to keep that in place for about 3 months if what you're saving is 100,000 lives. That's the calculation for the US. And that's about the political calculation that in fact seems to be working out, because after 2 to 3 months, it seems like we're moving to relax the extreme interventions that were put in and things are opening up. That corresponds to the numbers that I'm presented. And of course, we could think about different numbers. I was trying to present a framework. Finally, let me make a few points about what I think might be permanent changes coming out of this crisis. As has already been mentioned, I think there's going to be a permanent reduction in global trade. And I think a general movement toward producing goods more domestically. In the US, that would mean an expansion of manufacturing back toward partly levels that were present in the past. This could be especially in terms of critical goods, but from a political standpoint, what's a critical good can become quite expansive. I think there is a long-term damage to the relationship between the United States and China coming out of this crisis. And that'll be partly involved with thinking about trade and global health and other issues. I think there's been a decrease in trust for China, coming out particularly of questions about transparency, especially in the early stages of this pandemic. So I think that's going to be a problem that's going to make it even more difficult than before to have amicable negotiations between the United States and China. Of course, there are other things that are going to be permanent, as is obvious. There's going to be more work at home, more of these Zoom-type internet sessions that have become familiar. I think currency is basically going to disappear, which hadn't been true. On the other hand, I think that to a large extent, after a couple years, people are going to basically forget about this pandemic. I don't think it's going to be something that in the long run people are going to continually have in mind. That was also true in 1918. Even though the great influenza killed 40 million people roughly worldwide, after a couple of years, people basically forgot about it. And I think that that will be true in the current situation. Thank you.
It is really interesting to hear this optimistic viewpoint and several solutions. Thank you, Professor Barro, for sharing your insight and knowledge with us. But we can discuss more about China and US relationship during the panel discussion. And next, Dr. Kwang-Woo, Chairman of Institute for Global Economics and former Chairman of Financial Services Commission, will give us the last keynote speech.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. First of all, I'm so very delighted to join this webinar, which is the very first occasion co-hosted by Chosun Ilbo and CKGSB. Now, I'm also very happy to be part of this event, along with the two outstanding scholars representing United States and China, respectively. Now, as we all know, COVID-19 is making the most devastating economic damage since the Great Depression. Not to mention serious human casualties of the last 5 months. Now, the world is at a crossroads in fighting against the pandemic crisis. On the one hand, we see some encouraging signs, such as gradual easing of lockdown, reopening of economy, and glimmer of hope for the development of vaccine. On the other hand, however, we face increasing challenges and uncertainties, which complicate and undermine our efforts to cope with the economic crisis we face now. I would like to highlight some of these headwinds, challenges, which is also intended to lay a ground for subsequent discussion, because I am also serving as a moderator for this webinar today. I'm going to highlight 4 points here. First, the escalating tension between the United States and China is of great concern for all of us. Professor Barro has alluded to this already, but we'll certainly follow up through our discussion. But as someone put it, this confrontation is like great decoupling that's happening in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. As you know, the global problem requires global solution. But international cooperation is not working properly this time around. Sadly, it is going in the opposite direction. The coronavirus outbreak is also a wake-up call for the international community, and especially G2, to rebuild trust and leadership in global affairs. We must join force to avoid confrontation and promote collaboration in fighting against our common threat. This is high time for the United States and China to demonstrate their responsible leadership comparable to the size of their economy and influence. Secondly, further deteriorating economic prospects. I hope Robert is right in expecting V-shaped recovery down the road. We will come to that point. But broadly, the consensus appears to be further deterioration compared to earlier projection made by IMF and others. Especially this second quarter is likely to record historically low growth and employment. We must act decisively to expedite economic recovery, but at the same time, we need to pay great attention to building resilient and sustainable economy as well. I very much look forward to having insightful views about economic outlook and policy measures from our speakers today. The third is trade-off between containing pandemic and reopening economy. There are growing concerns over the second wave infection around the world these days, when most countries strive to open up economic activities. A typical strategy, exit strategy, calls for slow and phased approaches, but the resumption of business cannot be delayed for too long. It is true that developing vaccine and treatment is essential to provide a critical momentum for turnaround. But in the meantime, we must find a way to strike a balance between the two inevitable conflicts. Last but not least, reshaping of economic paradigm that is called post-COVID-19 new normal. We are moving into uncharted territory as we confront significant changes between before and after pandemic. Regarding the continued trend of deglobalization, let's not forget the virtues of globalization in promoting growth by way of active trade and investment across countries. Deglobalization should not be taken the end of globalization, but rather should be the evolution of globalization. That is to say, we must resist temptation for blind nationalism in the wake of the COVID-19. Our collective wisdom can help shed light on how the world will look like and what we must do to make the world a better place to live. I'm hoping to discuss these and other related issues today in positive and constructive spirit with our prominent speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jun, for your insightful speech. You really left the attendees hungry for more. And now this marks the end of the keynote speech session, and we will move to the panel discussion. Dr. Kwang-Woo will be the moderator for this session. Dr. Jun, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And actually, the last speaker has a disadvantage of having to repeat some of the issues that have already raised by previous speakers. But I'm happy to repeat and pursue, explore further discussion on this. Some of the issues we have already raised with the hopes that we can have the most of the intelligence and insight from our speakers today. Now, I would like to open up our discussion with G2 decoupling and international, I would say, international disorder. Bing has already said that this is not the new thing. This international discord has been there because of the continuing trade dispute between G2 countries for at least for the last 2 or 3 years. And the point here is that because of this COVID-19, there appears to be a new round of the confrontation between United States and China. Now, my question to you is that how do you take this current situation? By that I mean, is it that serious, as someone put it, like Financial Times, FT, I call it as the beginning of new Cold War? Or is exaggerated, more or less politically motivated, than real. So I would like to start with perhaps Bing. Would you like to say a few words about what your take on the current situation?
Well, in the past, under President George W. Bush, U.S. helped China immensely in fighting against the spread of SARS. And in Obama administration, China, U.S. worked really together to deal with this H1N1, H7N9, and Ebola outbreak. For this kind of global pandemic, China and the US must work together. For global governance to work, for strengthening international organizations, number one, US may need to return to the leadership role, and US-China must work together. And I said in the past conferences, I don't see a plan B. There's only plan A available. We need to rise above our differences, really work together constructively, forward-looking. Whatever differences, we need to read a dialogue, sit down. In what way we can make it better, not pointing fingers at each other. I think this is going to be so essential for China, for US, for the global community, not only for fighting against this kind of virus, but also for global economy to recover as well, and for shaping the new global order to come. So that's my hope. I hope that's the way moving forward. And then not only the government, but also I think the business, the universities, I think we need to develop talents that are truly global minded, globally responsible. They need to compete, collaborate with compassion, empathy. When we set up the school in 2002, we brought the humanities, history, religion, philosophy to the business school. We're the very first business to do that. Today, this become more critical. The compassion, the empathy, it could be so essential. The attitude, as you stressed, it could be so essential. That's the way I see it forward. Thank you.
Okay, but your point was well taken. Robert, could you add your perspective to this discussion? Perhaps I'm sure we all agree that for speedy recovery, economic recovery, and speedy containment of a virus, we all need to work together. But to relieve this tension between two countries, what needs to be done? What sort of ideas or steps that we that counterparts must consider in relieving this tension?
Well, let me try to provide some of my perspectives on the China-US relationship in particular. I should say first that I've been a great fan of China for some time, particularly in terms of the great achievement of economic growth since the end of the 1970s and the opening up to markets and basically to capitalism. And in the recent trade war, I thought the United States was basically in the wrong. And I thought China was being more constructive in its thinking, even though there were issues about technology transfer and such that were pertinent. But given this success that China's had, I was really quite disappointed with their reaction early on with regard to the coronavirus pandemic. It seems like there was a lot of lack of transparency, which I think produced a lot of costs. I think it produced a lot of costs throughout the world. But even if that's correct, and there's some kind of guilt there, I think today, in thinking about going forward, there's really no way to do anything about that. Even if it's true that China did not behave optimally, particularly in the early stages of this pandemic. The situation I'm reminded of is the end of World War I and the Versailles Treaty in terms of the treatment of Germany. And some people thought it was really important to punish Germany because they viewed Germany as being guilty of having initiated the war. And there was a lot of pressure to put unreasonable reparations on Germany. And it worked out terribly. It was not a good idea at all. And many people believe that that action eventually led to World War II. And then I think it was better after World War II, where we didn't have that approach. The approach there was not to so much look at who was at fault, including Germany again, but rather to start from where you were and go forward in a mutually productive manner. And that's what I think is the best thing to do with respect to this G2, but US and China. I think it's best to forget about who was guilty or not, and to start from where we are and try to work together to accomplish things in terms of global trade and international relationships, and working together in terms of health-related global issues. So that's what I think on these matters.
Thank you, Robert. I hope two leaders of G2 listen carefully to what you said just before and try to find a way out of this very costly dispute, tension, and we have to move forward for mutual reconciliation and more productive resolution. Bing, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think, you know, the strategic dialogue mechanism in Obama administration, I think would be very, very valuable. So whatever differences, disparity you have, is very important to sit down to talk about details. Can we do better for each other? That's very important. Always future oriented, always constructive, always try to reduce the differences. I like that mechanism. That's very essential.
All right. Is there any possibility that some of the international organizations work as a sort of mediator to help narrow the difference between two G2? For example, during 2008 global financial crisis, as you know, G20 framework worked very well to facilitate international efforts to overcome crisis at a time. Now, that is not working very well at the moment, but is there any way to sort of resharpen the mandate of international organization to help ease the tension? Any thought?
You know, played an instrumental role in dealing with 2008 global financial crisis. One reason for that was US and China could see eye to with each other. You know, it was valuable, it was maybe indispensable. I think for today's situation, for economic recovery after the pandemic, it's going to be equally valuable, maybe more valuable. For international organizations, because we need a global solution, as you mentioned, you know, only international organization can do that. They can go beyond the nationalism, the populism, the national interest, better than any other individual country. So this is very important. Thank you.
Robert?
Oh, the current US administration has intense hostility toward international organizations,
Sure.
which now has been extended also to the World Health Organization. And I can't see, at least in the current political environment, which may not go on for too much longer, I guess, working through international organizations as a kind of mediator instrument to improve things at the G2 level. I think it's more hopeful in terms of bilateral discussions, US and China. I think that was also true in the trade negotiations, you know, some months back. I think that that was proceeding to some extent in terms of US and China bilaterally, rather than, again, within the context of international organizations.
Right. Given that US administration has no great respect for multilateralism at the moment, certainly Rob has a good point. But, you know, I think some form of a bilateral and multilateral approach to help ease this tension, whatever it takes, will be very much needed. Otherwise, many think that this confrontation may last through generations, which is very detrimental not only to countries but also the entire global community. So we are hoping that very constructive dialogue could start soon as we face a deepening crisis down the road. Okay. Yeah, with that, I would like to move on to the economic outlook. I'm very anxious to hear about Robert's rather optimistic view. I hope you're right, because certainly there will be a good news. But at the same time, there are a lot of skepticism about a V-shape or any strong rebound within a short period of time, because the kind of damage that has been inflicted is not something that can be easily cured, especially with the huge impact on the area of employment, and not to mention disruptions in global supply chains, all those issues. So would you elaborate on your contention that we can rely on V-shaped recovery? I think if you make a strong case for this, that would be good news for stock market, Rob.
You know, I'm very empirically oriented, so my first instinct is to look for history to try to learn about these kinds of recoveries. But I don't think you can find very much. And I don't think it's very instructive to look, for example, at recent recessions like the 2008, 2009, which was related to financial markets, housing markets, and involved a much more gradual kind of recovery. It also was not as extreme a downturn. I think the current situation is very different, but I'm looking at it as kind of a conceptual, theoretical way. And I think as long as the current downturn doesn't go on for too long, we really haven't destroyed most of the things that are in place that look like capital. That's obvious for physical capital, human capital in the sense of education. I don't think we would have destroyed a lot of linkages between firms and suppliers if this doesn't go on too long, and similarly between firms and workers. So that's why it makes sense to me that if the shutdown is terminated and we're reopening, that you could get back very quickly to the levels of economic activity that you were at previously. So I tried to look at history and what do I find for the closest parallels to the current situation. So I'll tell you what I came up with. I don't know if you're going to agree that it's parallel or not, but the biggest recoveries that look like that in terms of the world record are actually after major wartime contractions of economic activity in countries where you didn't have a tremendous amount of physical destruction. So in World War II, you had a number of countries that were occupied by Germany. In particular, you have France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And in 1944, they're liberated from German occupation. And if you look at the recoveries after that, 1944 to 46, the average increases in gross domestic product over 2 years are between 40 and 50% for those countries. And I think that has something of an analog to the current situation. You basically had this shutdown, but you didn't destroy a lot of stuff that looks like capital. And then you open things up. And even though in those circumstances, you had the occupation for about 4 years, you had an extremely rapid recovery. And that's the best insight I've come up with. I know it's not something that looks so intimately connected to the current situation. That's why it's very hard to think about history in this context. I haven't found better analogs in looking at the history of many countries over many years. It really is a new situation.
Okay, thank you. Bing, would you like to say anything?
I hope it will be V-shaped, it'll be good for everyone. But I have some serious concerns. Number one is the US-China relation we talked about already. And then if China-US relation deteriorates, and that could be really bad for everyone, for global economy. And secondly, you know, there's going to be a strong pushback against globalization. So the era we had, and we probably not going to have anything like that for coming decade. You know. So that will, you know, impede the free flow of goods, investment, and people. And then so we have a new paradigm we made, you know. So, and then relating to that at the national level, you see some of the remarks by French President Macron and Mr. Modi, Prime Minister of India. Some of the key countries want to emphasize on economic self-reliance. That's going to be bad for global trade. That's not going to be good news for countries that are really export dependent, you know. And then that will increase the cost of living for many rich countries, you know. And then that will take away many opportunities for us to enjoy economy of scale and specialization, you know. So there's going to be some really bad news out there, you know. And then the companies, for many reasons, for cost, for diversification, for this, you know, this preparation for hiccups or disruption like coronavirus. So there's going to be a lot of readjustment, you know. So it's going to be a different type of system will be operating. And for Chinese companies, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to compete in many sectors that will be classified as a strategic by some countries, by national security related. You know, I mean, as you said, those definitions can be very expensive. They can cover many sectors. You know, even e-bus is included national security. You know, yeah. So this will give a lot of new grounds for those politicians that would like to promote the protectionism. They're going to have a popular support to make things even worse. They're going to have a political will to do that. So that's some of the potential negative things I see for a few years to come, maybe a decade to come. And there's going to be no possibility of WTO for decades to come. And then so I see the importance of regional trading blocks. You know, you see this new NAFTA, you see the new deal between Japan and EU. I would like to see a new deal between China, Korea, Japan, maybe ASEAN countries. So the regional, bilateral, trilateral regional deals will be the way forward for coming decade, I think. You know, so those are my.
Can I respond to that?
Sure, of course. Go ahead. Yeah.
You know, I'm broadly very sympathetic to the pro-global trade arguments that you made. But I think mostly what's at stake here is something contributing to long-run economic growth on the order of maybe 0.5% per year, like is the growth rate in the US going to be 2.5 versus 3% per year, which I think was what was at stake when we were talking about the trade war some months back. But here what we're talking about is a rebound from a contraction where GDP at an annual rate is down by something like 20%. And the rebound there is mostly about getting things reopened and back operating, back in place. And I don't think that the global trade contraction, even though that'll be serious in the long term, is going to have too much to do with this potential V-shaped recovery. That's why I think that that's still going to be in place. I mean, the other question in terms of recovery is whether the disease is going to go away or not, or whether we're going to have a second wave. Now, in the great influenza, you did have a second wave, which was much worse than the first wave. So after the spring of 1918, you had this second wave from September to February 1919, which was by far the worst. But that's not the usual experience. The usual experience is more about, as I understand it, about viruses disappearing or mutating. You have like SARS basically going away. You have seasonal flu, which goes away every year in a seasonal pattern. I don't think this is all that well understood, but the business of the second wave of disease, even though that was true in 1918, 1919, I think that's not the typical pattern in history.
Yeah, appreciate
Can I
your,
make one more remark on this one? Sorry.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
The way we should
the
operate.
pushback against the globalization, not because globalization has done no good. It's because in China, US, there's maybe a possibility too much capitalism. So the income was inequality getting out of hand and diminishing social mobility. So, you know, you can scapegoat the globalization for that. So if the income was inequality, diminishes social mobility, not mitigate effectively, you don't have a popular support for globalization. And accordingly, the politicians, any democracy, will have difficulty to promote globalization. So this coronavirus is really not the root cause of that. You know, so if we don't have the fundamental problem resolved, we're going to have the whole thing, the nationalism, the populism, coming back the strong way. We don't have the kind of globalization, you know, to come back the way we want. So that's the remark I would like to have. Yes.
Okay. All right. I think that point, and being earlier, you mentioned also the trouble we have with the international governance and the structural impediments to promote growth more actively. That I'm with you. That's an important change from before. Korea, if I share with you the experience we had in Korea, we have gone through, before this COVID-19, at least two major economic crises. There was, one was part of Asian financial crisis, that is 1997 to 8. And the more recent one was the global financial crisis of 2008. In those cases, Korea was very successful in rebounding from the shock, and one of the fastest recovering countries at that time. Now, what's the difference then from those experience and this one? If I add a couple of caveats to the hope for V-shaped recovery, the first is, as Robert and you have already mentioned, those two previous crises were not inflicted by virus. It's a different kind of source of crisis. It's a pandemic, and until you have a good control of this by way of developing vaccine or treatment, the resumption of normal economic activities will be rather difficult. So that's one caveat we have to deal with. The other one has to do with China. Now, thanks to China's very vibrant economy during the period of two previous economic crises, that is during 2008 or late 1997 or 8, those were the times when China showed very impressive growth period, which was as a good sort of had a good externality to Korea's recovery and was benefited in a way. But this time, not just Korea, but around the world, since China plays such an important role in the global economy. Now, in recent years, we have seen gradual decline in the growth performance in China and structural bottlenecks, problems China faces these days. So these are the kind of issues that we need to keep in mind when we project a global recovery on the road. But still, I'm hoping for V-shaped recovery. No
Can I make a remark on this one? I think no doubt Korea did well for this, for dealing with the two crises, but there's a regime change here. For the past 40 years, two pillars of global economy, maybe more. One is Thatcher neoliberalism, starting in 1978, followed by 1979 China by Deng Xiaoping's opening up reform policy, President Reagan as well. So China, US may have embraced neoliberalism better than any other country globally. The second pillar was globalization, greatest globalization era in human history. So, and the rise of China. So I think Korea as an export-led economy have benefited substantively from this regime. But I think the regime will be changed fundamentally. We see the limit of neoliberalism in China and in the US. China, US may need to search for new models. And there could be a possibility imbalance of development models, like too much neoliberalism in China, US, too much state social democracy in Europe. So there's imbalance across regions. So that could be a problem. Okay, so there could be a new regime, even without the coronavirus. I think we're already in the process searching for a new one. Thank you. Yes.
Robert?
Yeah. Well, maybe I could make a few comments about South Korea. I've been critical for a few years about the policy being carried out by the government in Korea under this slogan, income-led growth, which has been in place for a few years. And I think it represented a movement of Korea away from kind of a market capitalism orientation and export-led economy, and toward more of a populism that was focused on things like income redistribution and higher taxes on companies and on wealthy individuals. I thought that had already led to a situation where Korea's growth rate had gone down quite substantially. And it looked like that might be permanent before the coronavirus issue. It looked like Korea was no longer going to be the growth engine that it had been for so long. So I don't know where the status of that is from a political standpoint, whether the coronavirus has in fact strengthened this populism move that was already moving in place in Korea. And it's also true going forward, given its dependence on exports, that Korea may be particularly harmed by contractions related to global trade. I mean, some places like Vietnam, I would expect to benefit by substituting, particularly for China, in terms of international supply chains. But I don't know that that's going to apply to Korea in the same way.
Well, I think I have to respond to Robert's comment on South Korea. First, I would like to say that certainly your criticism of government policy, often referred to as income-led growth, And you have a point there, and I think we have to make necessary adjustment to the existing policy stance in coping with this coronavirus crisis. But as of now, it is clear that the government feels strongly that government has to play a bigger role in revitalizing the economy, to reflect on the major changes that we expect to have throughout this pandemic period. So I think government is looking forward, taking forward-looking postures. So I'm hoping that to reflect on your very constructive comments, I think I hope some adjustment to be made so that we can, energize private sector companies as a new engine for growth, so that Korea can resume its strong performance, growth performance down the road. Export-led economy side, of course, it's one of the drawback of our economic structure. We need to expand a domestic consumption side more so that we have a better balance between export and domestic consumption. Now, there again, this is a very difficult period. The economy needs a lot of support, especially in those areas like small and medium-sized companies and self-employed businesses are heavily affected by the crisis. So government is trying to shore up their survivability, so that they can be part of this more balanced, creating more balanced structure at home. Now, by the way, this small and medium companies and self-employed business account for more than 80% of the entire workforce in Korea. So they need to be also protected, but at the same time to promote the strong leadership of large corporations to be competitive in the global market. So the government is trying to achieve dual objectives along that line.
I offer a remark on this one.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Actually, something we did over the past 7 years was attempt to try to contribute to mitigate some of the problem faced, being faced by many countries. The idea was called economic disruption. We want to help young people have a possibility when they become a unicorn company. If you compare China, Japan is really noted for its excellence in innovations. But Japan didn't do well for the past 3 decades in terms of generating new companies, new billionaires. And you see, every 5-10 years, there's a sea change in the list of richest people in China, and a new company emerging. That's really unique. You compare with China and India, roughly similar in population size. You don't see much change in list of richest people in India, okay? So if the economies do not give young people hope, you're going to see a flood of problems you see in France, in Chile, even as a democracy, okay? So to give young people hope, always new generation of companies, newly rich, social responsible is a way forward. I think the schools, business sector have much to contribute, better than just government, income-led growth model. That's one segment. Sorry.
Okay, great. That point was very well taken. Before we move on to next topic, I would like to ask Bing one thing about your important gathering in Beijing tomorrow. this National People's Congress meeting convening tomorrow, right? It has been delayed for some time, but finally is taking place. And there's an expectation that Beijing authorities may come up with more aggressive stimulus package. Could we expect something like that, or is it?
Well, you know, this whole reconfiguration, global governance, economic order is still in process. And I think China probably in better shape because even there's a strong pushback against globalization. China has a large size GDP and a population domestic market, relatively complete supply chain. No country enjoy a complete supply chain. I mean, for many sectors, you know, and so China might do well in that regard. I'm very positive in the sense that the coming the conference will focus on you know, containing the spread of this virus and get the economy back to work, and also you know to improve the international environment of China. I think this is going to be the three key issues to be focused upon. Yes, that's my 2 cents.
Okay, but isn't it also true that the investment community around the world feels strongly that Chinese authorities have rather limited policy measures at this time because of very substantial national debt, and also compared to other major economies, inflation is relatively high. So what that means is that the scope for additional monetary and fiscal expansion is rather narrow.
I don't agree with that. You know, China has so many instruments to play with. For example, we have about 30 sectors remain to be deregulated. The neoliberalism, Ms. Thatcher, has run its course in the US, spent force, because in the US, virtually every sector is deregulated. But in China, we have so many. You know, we can just keep on growing the economy by deregulations. And China has been underinvested in terms of social security program. Our educational system only covers 9th grade. We don't have universal health care. We don't have universal pension system. You know, I mean, so we have a lot to catch up. Just the deregulation. So neoliberalism in China has a lot of miles left. We can grow the economy by a new round of deregulations.
So aren't there issues in China in terms of having overbuilt certain types of capital, like commercial real estate and apartment buildings, and trying
there could be
don't work properly and things like that?
Yeah, there could be, but you know, if they can grow the economy, we can deregulate oil and gas, telecom, financial services, education, media, sports. You know, we have so many sectors meant to be deregulated. That's a key element of Deng Xiaoping's reform policy. So we have many reservoirs. We can leave the game.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's okay. China will be all right. So
I hope you're right on that too. Okay. All right, shall we move on to the third out of four sort of group of issues that we would like to discuss? That has to do with the trade-off between containing pandemic and reopening economy. Actually, Professor Barro has some comment on that already, but I think this is a critical dilemma we face in our recovery efforts because of the, you know, as we all recognize, the possibility of a second wave infection. No country is immune to this. China has a problem. Even Korea has some of these issues, and the latest hotspot around the world is Brazil. Now they are becoming a country that see huge increase in new infections and death. So on the one hand, we really try to reactivate our economy, but certainly there is a clear hurdle in moving along that line, because it could again jeopardize the speedy opening of the economy. So striking a balance between these two is, I don't think it's a science, more of art, I think, on the part of policymaker. There's no clear direction we can sort of give to policymakers. But given your extensive experience and the experience we had long before, Robert, would you like to say something to government authorities hesitating or debating when to open and how to open the economy by reducing the risk of new infections to a minimum? Is there any way or guidelines you would like to share with us?
You know, I think this is the first time that we've had this wide-scale implementation of these public health interventions that look like basically curtailing business, and related to that, having this sharp contraction of the gross domestic product. This really was not put into place, even in the great influenza pandemic, which was much more serious as a medical problem. You had things like school closings then and prohibitions on public gatherings, but you didn't have this mass curtailment of business, which is something different here. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm saying it's something new. And in terms of the reasonable trade-off, we've about gotten to the limit in the US and other places in terms of what seems to make sense in this trade-off between reduced loss of life versus reduced economy. And that's why, again, I think there's this movement towards opening up pretty broadly. And I think that makes sense. Again, I said a little bit about potential second wave, and I really have no great way to predict that. It's definitely a possibility, but it's not inevitable. And the vaccine track seems to be quite promising and on a much more rapid time scale than is normal. So I think that can be positive. In terms of what you said about Brazil, I might note that it was very strongly true in the great influenza pandemic, 1918 to 20, that it was the poorest countries that had the worst outcomes by far. And the worst situation was in India, which contributed about 40% of the world's deaths in that incident. And it was worse in Africa than most other places, and also bad in some parts of particularly Central America. But I think that's also likely to be true in the current situation. Eventually, it'll be mostly the poorer countries that will experience the most deaths, the highest death rates. I think that will be also a characteristic of the situation.
Well, all right. Bing, would you like to anything about this? Because China is also...
But I have some concerns. My concerns about certain national economies where they depend heavily on international tourism, education. And then this going to be like, if the whole this pandemic will go on for another year, that's going to be a huge damage on the economy. For many medium-sized, small-sized companies, many of them would have difficulty surviving if whole thing goes on for another 3 or 6 months, working capital-wise. I mean, their business model is good, everything's good, but there could be serious challenge for many business if this whole thing goes on for another 3 or 6 months. So that's my concern, very serious concern. Yeah, thank you. I don't have an estimate like, how this whole thing, I cannot advise government in terms of what to do. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Well, I think that's partly why there's so much pressure after about up to 3 months of closure.
Yes.
Opening up, because as you say, the longer you're doing it, the more you're creating permanent damage. And I think there's a lot of businesses that can operate in a reasonably safe manner, but you're right, certain sectors are going to be more in a permanent down situation, particularly things to tourism, travel. So it's still out there as to when we'll be able to open up with regard to those sectors.
Okay, I would like to leave this third category of discussion and move to the last part. That has to do with, as I mentioned in my earlier intervention, kind of what sort of major changes do you expect between before and after? Although we can also say something about these changes could be permanent, or some changes that we are talking about here could prove rather temporary because of when coronavirus becomes under control, things could back to the original situation. So could you say something about what the major structural fundamental changes that you see in the so-called new normal? I don't know whether that is good expression for this, but obviously certain industrial areas may face fundamental changes, and very damage could be very permanent. Whereas some others are quite different situations. So would you say something along that line?
Robert, you want to start first?
Okay. I think most of the impact is going to be temporary. And as I mentioned before, I think if you look a year or two down the road, if there's not a resurgence of disease, then I think people are mostly going to forget about it. Even though now we're so preoccupied with this ongoing pandemic that there's almost nothing else to think about. I think that that's mostly going to be a temporary situation. We've talked about some changes in the economic structure that are likely to be more permanent. Some of these are things that were already evolving in terms of an increased tendency to work at home and to rely more on the internet, the kinds of interactions that we're having today. I must say, in terms of my own lecturing at Harvard, I don't find this kind of internet interrelationship with students as a good substitute for being in a classroom with somebody. I don't think it really is that good a substitute. So I'm hoping that that will be a temporary change in regard to teaching structure. We talked a lot about the longer run changes relating to global trade. And I agree that that's going to be negative. And to some extent, it's reinforcing what was already in place in terms of protectionist tendencies. Some of it coming from the United States, which has more traditionally been a leader in terms of promoting free trade, and that's not so true these days. So I think there's going to be some permanent reduction in the extent of global trade, and I think that's going to make people worse off in terms of standard of living. But that's not in terms of this massive short-run contraction that we're currently experiencing. I think that's basically something different from the kind of longer-run productivity effects related to free trade. I think those things are important, but they're not the same thing.
All right, thank you. Bing, would you like to add to the major changes? Some temporary, some permanent. Yeah.
At the geopolitical level, I was hoping with the coronavirus, China-US can really rise above our differences really work together, not only by the two, but also with the global community to fight this common virus, okay, and get the economy recovered. I think this is a beautiful opportunity here, okay, to put aside our differences. I still hope this could be the way forward, you know. So this, and secondly, I would like to see China, US really working together to strengthen the international organization, in particular, not only the WHO, but the G20, because that's so far the only effective global mechanism, make sure the global coordination to promote the global economic recovery. We don't have any other better mechanism. It was truly good for the 2008 global financial crisis. Why we cannot go back, you know, to improve the work? So this is my hope. And at a national level, I want to see less protectionism. I still a believer in free trade, but in order to achieve that, I think number one, there need to be a coordination, a balance of development models. Neoliberalism in China and the US, state, well, you know, China also has some elements of state capitalism. The social democracy in Europe, there could be some balance, you know, between among those nations. And secondly, you need to give young people a hope. I hope the disruption program should be in place, emphasized by government. So young people always have a chance doing better, moving upward, you know. So this could be essential for generating popular support for new era of globalization. So politicians will have a mandate to promote that, you know. Others will be pointing fingers at each other, escaping good, you know. So always in that, you know, the cycle, okay. And thirdly, I think we need to go beyond the government. Government will play important role, but business, universities, NGOs, international organization, it's about time we really emphasize on global perspective and global responsibilities. It's about time for us to bring really positive, beautiful elements of humanity, to emphasize on compassion and empathy, not only economics, but also compassion, empathy. That could be so essential for the future of humanity. If we don't work, act together, I think, you know, we're gonna be in plan B. That'd be so much worse than plan A. To me, it's always plan A. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good point.
So can I say,
sure, Robert, yes, okay.
About the coronavirus pandemic and this cooperation thing. Some aspects of it are very natural for cooperation. If you think about developing vaccines and treatments, which are obvious public goods, that's an easy area to have cooperation. You can get into trouble, however, when there's a vaccine that's discovered and you're trying to allocate the supplies if they're limited. That'll be much harder to cooperate with. And similarly, if you think of other kinds of supplies, even masks, there can be competition there rather than cooperation. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing that the US doesn't know how to make any masks, for example. But I think the coronavirus situation cuts two ways in terms of whether or not it promotes cooperation or something more like a competition that would not be so healthy.
Okay, all right. I would like to make one comment on Robert's point earlier. I am pretty much with you on your saying that this online teaching education is not a good substitute for real class. I'm very much with you because now I'm thinking of the famous phrase by Jack Welch, a legendary CEO. He once said something like this: you cannot become a true global leader only through internet or telephone. You need to have a real interaction with good people. I think that has a point. I think it's great to have a webinar like this to utilize the available technology. Given the situation, it's great to have this. But I'm hoping that at some future occasion, I'd like to see both in real form rather than just over internet, because that's a different, right? You have more close networking or this feeling about what others think about the kind of issues. So I think this real interaction is very important. I'm not saying that the webinar is less effective. I'm just great, channel through which we can discuss, exchange our views under this tough situation. I'm very grateful for this, but especially for teaching. I think those students should learn from interacting with one another, each other, not just learning from internet. Because the story that I gather from people in the Silicon Valley, they are mostly now work from home, right?
Right.
And they feel that they seem to lose a sense of innovation or creativity by just sitting alone, because they should nurture each other for more productive thinking through real context. So that's what they seem to be saying. So hopefully
I mean, Harvard is having this debate now about whether it'll be able to have in-person classes in September or not. Some students argue that the whole point of going to Harvard was to have in-person relationships with professors and fellow students. And they think you should just postpone the whole semester if you can't have in-person interaction.
So
It's certainly a debate.
From our experience, like most of our students are chairman CEOs, they learn from these faculty members, but also may learn more from their peers. And not only in class, but also after class, drinking together, going out activity together. So that's going to be essential. You don't get that from internet, especially for chairman CEO level. Jack Ma is alone, like for his level of seniority, learning from each other is very important, the peers.
Great. We have 2 minutes to go. Perhaps 1 minute each. Comment on what industry do you think will thrive in the new era of post COVID-19? Just guess, prediction of. Relatively speaking, some industries will have a hard time, and maybe the downturn, irreversible or downturn. Some others could come back very easily. So, what are the promising areas for business purpose, and also for your students who plan for their career, where they should find growing opportunities down the road? For policymakers, what kind of areas they need to emphasize in further promoting economic growth?
Which businesses have done relatively well in the current crisis, and which industries have done the worst. Some that have done the best are places that can function even when there's a shutdown, and you can do online shopping. So Walmart is doing well, and Amazon. But that is temporary. That's like the question is this going to be a permanent or a temporary situation? So I don't think those benefits are going to continue so much. We already mentioned concern about things related to tourism and travel, and that might be more of a persistent negative kind of a sector going forward.
Okay, thank you. Bing, any final comment on this?
Well, I think for the future, not only the Amazon.com type of companies or Alibaba, JD.com type of companies will benefit from this, but also this. I think in the future, maybe more focus on well-being and healthcare, and then GDP may be less emphasized. So some of those sectors will benefit. From Chinese company point of view, the Chinese company is really good at what I call non-mainstream sectors, like ties, lighters, socks, sewing machines. The Chinese company will continue to do well. I mean, we have been playing a domestic help role for U.S. economy. China's economic threat to the U.S. is greatly exaggerated. I mean, we only got one company, Huawei, that are competing in the mainstream sector. Okay, but they got nailed by national security grounds. We are domestic helper for the U.S. And then the low value added. So those sectors, Chinese company will continue to do well because there's no ideology constraint, socks, whatever. So the Chinese company will do well. But for the mainstream sector, is represented by Huawei. And because of new protectionism, because there's relation between China and the US, I think they're going to have a really difficult time, more challenges for the future.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, I think it's time to close. I thank you both very much for stimulating discussion and excellent exchange of insightful views for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jun, and all the speakers for delivering stimulating and insightful session. Now, this marks the end of the ALC webinar, and as we have mentioned earlier, due to concerns of COVID-19, we have decided to postpone the 11th ALC until November. Therefore, starting from this month, we will continue to prepare webinars with influential speakers around the world. Again, thank you everyone for participation, and we hope to see you again. And thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye now.
Goodbye.
Bye.